Dixie here. 4 years ago, I put out a video titled Why I Don't Wear GORE-TEX Footwear in an attempt to share my personal experience and hopefully save some hikers some troubles. And y'all, it chapped a lot of people's butts. Even though I made that video after completing the Triple Crown of hiking, which is the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, and Continental Divide Trail, a lot of commenters said that I must have not had enough experience. So after completing several more thousands of miles of trail, I wanted to touch base again and explain why I still do not use GORE-TEX footwear. I also want to address some concerns I saw in the comments of that video and maybe clarify some points that I didn't explain well enough last time. If you're not familiar with GORE-TEX, it's a material that's designed to be waterproof but also ventilated. So it's supposed to keep water from entering things like your rain jacket or your waterproof shoes, but still allow the body to breathe and have some ventilation if it's heating up and sweating. And that in principle sounds really nice, but unfortunately it did not serve me well the way it was designed out on trail. And I think one of the reasons I felt the need to do this follow-up video is so many of the commenters on that last video who were chastising me for my personal feelings about GORE-TEX were really kind of just repeating my points back to me as to why GORE-TEX just does not suit my purpose. So I want to clarify that I don't think GORE-TEX in and of itself is bad. It just doesn't necessarily work well for applications, especially like a thru hike where you're out on trail for 6 months at a time and you're hiking through the summer. So these are the reasons that I do not prefer GORE-TEX. First, feet sweat. It's pretty much inevitable if you get warm out on trail, and even if your body doesn't feel super warm, the friction of your feet, it's just likely going to cause some sweat. Some people's feet sweat more than others. I would say, as gross as it sounds, I probably have sweatier feet than some other people. And although GORE-TEX is supposedly breathable, that was not the case for me, or at least the GORE-TEX didn't keep up well with the amount of heat that my feet produced and how much sweat needed to be ventilated. And the GORE-TEX trail runners that I started using as I entered the Smokies on the Appalachian Trail were certainly not as breathable as the trail runners I used before that were non-GORE-TEX, and all of the non-GORE-TEX trail runners I've used since then. My issue with trapping the foot in a warm, dark, damp place is it can lead to some pretty gnarly foot issues. It can cause blisters and also foot funk like trench foot. And nobody seems to argue the point of sweat with rain gear. If you talk to people about rain gear, most hikers will say, well, you really have two options. You can be wet from the rain or you can be wet from sweat. So I'm not really sure where the mental block is when it comes to waterproof footwear, that it's not the same idea as rain gear. So to this sweat issue point that I made in the last video, a lot of commenters said that I needed good socks, and specifically wool socks. But the funny thing about that is, I'd say 99% of the days that I've gone out backpacking, I've had wool socks on, and especially on the Appalachian Trail, specifically in this section when I had my GORE-TEX trail runners. So for me, wearing wool socks did not mitigate this issue. Again, in my opinion, and for my feet specifically, no amount of ventilation offered by GORE-TEX can keep up with the amount of air my foot needs to stay dry on a dry day. If your feet never sweat, then this won't be an issue for you, but some of my next points might be. My next issue with GORE-TEX is if you are out in a soaking rain for long enough, your feet are going to end up wet. Yes, even in GORE-TEX footwear, because at some point the rain is going to run down your leg and into your shoe. One commenter suggested that wearing rain pants will prevent this. But I did have rain pants on every single day that it rained while I was wearing my GORE-TEX trail runners. And even though I was wearing rain pants, just the motion of walking around and my rain pants rubbing together and things splashing up off the ground, or maybe even having the issue of your rain pant gets hung up on the edge of your shoe. I mean, things happen while you're moving around and backpacking out in the woods. But regardless, my feet did end up getting wet. In my opinion, the only thing that might prevent your waterproof trail runners from getting water down in them while it's raining is wearing a waterproof gaiter. This would be the best solution paired with rain pants. If I knew I was going to be hiking on a shorter trip where it was going to be cold and rainy the entire time, then I might try something like this. But over a 2,000 plus mile trek where you're out there for 6 or so months, you really learn to embrace the suck-in situations instead of adding on more weight to your pack, because carrying just several more ounces here and several more ounces there really adds up on your back and on your knees for a period of 6 months. But there are luxury items that we all carry, and if having wet feet in the rain is one of your pet peeves, then it might be worth it to you to have the extra weight of waterproof gaiters. But also keep in mind that as far as the sweat issue goes, if you're adding yet another layer of waterproofing, rain pants, waterproof gaiters, waterproof shoes, you're probably going to up your sweat factor with having less breathability. Even with all of that waterproofing, it does not fix my next issue with GORE-TEX, which is wearing GORE-TEX footwear when doing a water crossing. If you submerge your leg in a creek or a river, you do have this big old hole in the shoe where your foot goes in, so obviously water is going to come in there and get your foot wet. One commenter said that their GORE-TEX shoes were so good that they even only got minimally wet when completely submerged in a water crossing. Even if that is true, that was not my personal experience. Like any normal shoe, when I submerged it, water poured in around my ankles and I ended up with a pool of water in my shoe when I got to the other side. Not the end of the world, and yes, you can just take your shoes off and dump them out when you get over to the other side, but GORE-TEX does take longer to dry out than other shoes, again, because it has less breathability. Although one person said their GORE-TEX shoes dried out just as fast as everybody else they were hiking around that had non-GORE-TEX, more ventilated shoes, and y'all, that's just not logical. Now, you can cross barefooted if you want to, or take water shoes to change into, but me personally, again, on a 6-month through hike or even on a shorter hike where I know I'm gonna have a lot of creek crossings, I don't want to stop and take the time to deal with that. But again, that's a personal preference of mine. Now, I will concede where some people said it matters where the GORE-TEX liner is sewn into the footwear. So if it is on the very inside of the trail runner, then sure, you've got your foot, a sock, and immediately that waterproof membrane, then that might work out a little better as far as the shoe not getting soaked on the inside and having to worry about it drying out on the inside because it's waterproof right there. So there is no material on the inner part that would hold on to water. But it seems that most footwear, and at least the ones that I had on my AT hike, did not have that membrane sewn directly on the inside of the shoe right next to the foot. Instead, there was some kind of cushioning or padding, and then somewhere in the middle of the layers was the GORE-TEX membrane and then the outer part of the shoe. But even if you did find some footwear that had the GORE-TEX liner directly on the inside, your foot is going to hold that sweat in there if you are somebody who has a foot that sweats. Next, GORE-TEX is not going to be waterproof and breathable forever. I mean, obviously no piece of backpacking gear lasts forever, but if you've got this shoe that you've purchased with the intention of it being waterproof and also breathable, it's a membrane that will eventually fail over time and let water in, and also as far as breathability goes, walking down the trail and having the dust and grime, that can clog the pores and make the breathability nearly zero. Finally, GORE-TEX footwear is typically a bit more expensive than its non-GORE-TEX counterparts, maybe only by $15 to $20, but if you're on the fence about GORE-TEX and you're on a tight budget, then that's something that you might want to consider. So are there any applications in which I would use GORE-TEX? Yes, absolutely there are. If I planned for a winter trip where I would be backpacking in the snow or freezing rain, then yes, pairing some GORE-TEX trail runners with some waterproof gaiters would probably be the way that I would go. Or possibly even on a short little trip when it's not winter time, but I am experiencing colder temperatures and wind. For example, the Mount Kilimanjaro trek I took. I had non-waterproof trail runners and my feet were a little bit colder at the summit than I would prefer for them to be. I think if I had had some GORE-TEX trail runners and some waterproof gaiters, that it would have helped block out some of that wind and the chill from my feet. Especially on that trek, I was still struggling with getting out of the thru-hiker mindset, and I was carrying just a day pack. And although I think it's important to pack as light as possible because they require porters to carry your gear, having waterproof gaiters, that's something that I would have kept in my day pack, and I do think would have helped me at the summit with blocking out some of that wind factor. Another example is living in a climate where you're mostly going to be backpacking in rain if you go backpacking. Like the majority of the time in these places, it rains. Then yeah, maybe I don't want to have soaked feet the whole time I'm out there. There were a lot of commenters from different climates that mentioned that wearing GORE-TEX footwear and waterproof gaiters is just very normal around there because of how much precipitation they get. And finally, there was a comment where somebody mentioned they lived in the desert, I believe it was Utah, and they found that they were having to stop so frequently to dump sand and silt out of their footwear that they decided to try GORE-TEX. And because it's not as porous, they didn't have the same issues with as much sediment getting in their shoes as they did with more breathable footwear. I never had this specific issue when I was in the desert, but if I lived somewhere where I did notice this was time consuming for me on trail, then I would definitely consider GORE-TEX in that application. Another example of where GORE-TEX footwear makes sense to me is if you're somebody who takes your dog on a morning hike every morning, and you're out there first thing where there's still dew all over the ground and you really just kind of get tired of getting your feet wet. Well, having the GORE-TEX footwear to walk through the damp grass definitely makes sense. And finally, GORE-TEX makes the most sense to me in jacket form or in other applications like that. I noticed that most of the commenters who defended GORE-TEX also preferred to hike in boots, assuming they weren't just GORE-TEX employees. Now, I prefer trail runners to boots. It's fine if you want to hike in boots because it's all personal preference, but I still stand by that for me, in the way that I use my footwear in 3-season weather, that GORE-TEX is not the best for me, even after doing the things that people commented I should do when wearing GORE-TEX footwear, especially as a long distance hiker who tends to keep her hiking between spring and fall. So anyway, that is all I have for y'all today on GORE-TEX footwear, and I think that's all I'm gonna say about that. Thank y'all so much for watching, and as always, feel free to share your experience with GORE-TEX in the comments below and what applications it has worked well for you and in what ways it has not. I'm just one person with my own personal preferences and experiences that are not the same for everybody. Anyway, thank y'all so much for watching, and we will see y'all next time.